Are new wildlife reserves being placed over indigenous land without consent is a debate that raises serious ethical, legal, and conservation concerns about land rights and environmental justice. Wildlife reserves are created to protect endangered species, preserve biodiversity, and prevent habitat destruction from human activity. However, many conservation projects have been criticized for displacing indigenous communities and restricting their traditional way of life. Throughout history, indigenous people have lived in and managed forests, grasslands, and wetlands, often in ways that sustain biodiversity. Despite this, many governments and conservation organizations establish protected areas without consulting the indigenous groups who have stewarded these lands for centuries. Some indigenous leaders argue that conservation policies prioritize wildlife over human rights, treating indigenous people as obstacles rather than partners. In many cases, indigenous communities are forcibly evicted from their ancestral lands, losing access to traditional hunting, fishing, and farming areas. Governments justify these actions by claiming that reserves need to be free from human influence, ignoring the fact that indigenous land management has historically protected ecosystems. The term fortress conservation describes the practice of creating protected areas by removing indigenous inhabitants and banning traditional activities. This model has led to human rights abuses, forced displacement, and violent conflicts between indigenous groups and wildlife rangers. Reports from Africa, Asia, and South America document cases where armed conservation patrols have harassed, arrested, or even killed indigenous people for entering protected lands. Some conservation organizations receive international funding to expand wildlife reserves, yet fail to ensure that indigenous landowners are properly consulted. Many indigenous groups argue that conservation projects should be led by local communities, rather than imposed by governments or foreign NGOs. Studies show that indigenous managed lands often have equal or better conservation outcomes than state-run wildlife reserves. In the Amazon, indigenous territories contain some of the largest intact forests, preventing deforestation more effectively than many government-controlled parks. In Canada and Australia, indigenous-led conservation initiatives have successfully protected species, restored ecosystems, and maintained cultural traditions. Critics argue that excluding indigenous people from conservation efforts ignores traditional ecological knowledge, which has guided sustainable land management for generations. Many governments classify indigenous people as illegal poachers if they hunt in newly declared reserves, even when these practices have been sustainable for centuries. Instead of working with indigenous communities, some conservation programs enforce strict anti-hunting and land use bans, criminalizing traditional lifestyles. Some indigenous groups have been forced into poverty and food insecurity after being denied access to forests and rivers that once provided their sustenance. Conservation policies that exclude indigenous people risk creating resentment toward wildlife protection, making enforcement even more difficult. Some indigenous leaders argue that wildlife reserves should not be established without their free, prior, and informed consent as outlined in international agreements. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, states that governments must obtain voluntary and informed consent before taking indigenous lands. However, many countries ignore these principles, prioritizing conservation funding, tourism, and political interests over indigenous rights. Some conservationists argue that protecting wildlife requires strict government control over reserves, fearing that local governance may lead to unsustainable practices. However, research contradicts this, showing that indigenous-led conservation programs are highly effective in protecting biodiversity. In some regions, governments have used wildlife conservation as an excuse to seize land for mining, logging, and commercial agriculture. Once indigenous groups are removed, some protected areas are later leased to corporations for resource extraction, exposing the hypocrisy of conservation policies. The Maasai people in Tanzania have repeatedly been displaced from their lands under the pretext of conservation, only to see those lands used for safari tourism. In India, the creation of national parks has led to the forced eviction of indigenous Adivasi communities, despite their historical role in forest preservation. Even in North America, some indigenous groups have been denied access to ancestral lands now classified as national parks, limiting their ability to practice cultural traditions. Conservation should not mean erasing indigenous presence, but rather integrating traditional knowledge into modern wildlife protection efforts. The best conservation models involve collaborative management, where indigenous people are recognized as rightful stewards of their lands. Some countries are now recognizing indigenous rights by establishing co-managed reserves, where indigenous communities play a leading role in decision-making. In Australia, indigenous ranger programs have combined traditional fire management with modern conservation science, improving biodiversity while reducing wildfires. In Canada, indigenous protected areas are expanding, allowing communities to manage forests, fisheries, and wildlife on their own terms. The success of these models proves that wildlife conservation and indigenous land rights do not have to be in conflict. Instead of excluding indigenous groups, conservationists should support land restoration, respect local governance, and provide funding for indigenous-led initiatives. If governments truly care about protecting nature, they must recognize indigenous people as allies, not obstacles, in conservation efforts. Rather than forcing indigenous communities off their lands, conservation policies should focus on empowering local stewards and enforcing protections against corporate exploitation. The future of conservation should not be based on land grabs, forced removals, or militarized enforcement, but on collaboration, respect, and shared responsibility. The real question is not whether new wildlife reserves should exist, but whether they should be created without the voices and consent of the people who have protected these lands for generations.